Thank you for joining us today. My name is Allison Ban, and I'm the Executive Director at Spark, a Center for Social Research Innovation. Welcome to today's Spark Talk. Ethnographic methods for identifying cultural concepts of distress, developing reliable and valid measures. I'd like to begin today by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who are here before us and to recognize our responsibility to respect and honor the intimate relationship that Indigenous peoples have to this land. We are excited to welcome Jeffrey Snodgrass, who is a professor of anthropology at Colorado State University, the author of the Avatar Faculty, Ecstatic Transformations in Religion and Video Games, and Systematic Methods for Analyzing Culture, a Practical Guide. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Allison. Let me get situated here. I will share my slides and so forth. Oops, wait, sorry about that. I'll share. How does that look?
Looks great.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I appreciate Michelle's invitation and also Allison and Lynn for all the arrangements. Today, I'll discuss ethnographic methods that allow researchers to assess distress in a culturally sensitive manner. I'll cover a lot of ground, but if you're interested, you can always consult the Field Methods publication itself that serves as the basis of my talk, along with the final slide where I reference the work that I cite in this talk. I'll start with a brief overview of standard psychological approaches to assess distress cross-culturally. Then I'll sketch my ethnographic approach, followed by 3 examples of that approach in action. And I conclude with some thoughts on what I call emic or cultural insider validity. Just going to expand this a little bit. Okay. So with historical roots in colonial projects, which my co-authors and I describe in the article, the contemporary cross-cultural side disciplines draw from fields like clinical and social psychology. This means in scale development that researchers who study a particular topical area were considered the authoritative sources of appropriate questions. The literature would be culled and researchers pulled to develop items for such scales. These would be honed by a particular research group and pre-tested on convenience samples, often U.S. undergraduate students, or so-called WEIRD, that's an acronym, societies, for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies or samples. They would do this to eliminate poorly worded or misunderstood items until a set was identified with good properties assessed by internal consistency and retest validity. The term ethnography can refer both to a case study account of the culturally informed thought, experience, and behavior, characteristic of a particular group or setting, and also the research methods used to study those groups or settings. The culture piece relates to the fact that humans transmit information to each other, which becomes the basis of collective attention, intention, and action. Methodologically, this means that to fully explain human behavior and experience in a specific setting, including individuals' distress and suffering, researchers would need to understand what we might call local culture. That is, patterns of socially learned thought and practice. And ethnographers develop methods to do exactly that. These typically included open-ended phases of study relying on participant observation and informal interviews to reveal, among other things, unexpected patterns that were not yet known to the researcher. But they also included structure and even quantitative methods like field surveys to further clarify local thinking and behavior. Now, anthropologists interested in mental distress and suffering warn against the so-called category fallacy, a term that Arthur Kleinman first used. This category fallacy of assuming that Western biomedical categories, assuming that those are objective and culture-free, instead of as cultural explanatory models, that's again Kleinman's terminology, within specific societies. Attending the cultural insider, or what I call emic, or cultural insider perspectives, is necessary because, now I'm going to say a lot of things here, but I'll try to say them slowly. It's necessary because expressions of distress, thresholds of tolerance for distress, expectations about stress inherent in life, conceptions of what counts as a good life, symptom expression, and models of help-seeking behavior all vary across culture groups. I'd note, and you can see at the bottom there of the slide, the notion that cultural concepts of distress is now preferred among many anthropologists and cultural psychiatrists as inclusive language that does not impose a syndrome's rigid framework for organizing symptoms, cause, and prognosis. So that notion of a culture bound or a cultural syndrome is used less frequently now by anthropologists such as myself compared to cultural concepts of distress. For me, biomarkers are also ethnographic if they are used to reveal cultural processes, like those related to social stress. As an example, in a recent NSF-funded gaming project in Fort Collins, I turned to a company called Tasso, using their M20 devices to collect dried blood in small sponges in order to assess the way culturally inflected online connections might provide, in this case, university students at Colorado State University, with an important source of mental and physical health resilience during the COVID pandemic. The blood analysis focused on immune biology markers related to inflammation and antiviral activity, which are known to be sensitive to social relations, though this hasn't yet been established for online relations. So a few notes about what you see here. So that's the Tasso device in my lower right, or in the lower right of the slide. It actually fits on the shoulder, and there's a little button that you press. And these are 3D printed, incidentally, if you're interested. And some small needles go into the shoulder just below the skin. It's typically almost don't feel it, or just a small kind of pinch. And then a kind of suction pump draws blood out into that little plastic rectangle that you see. There are some older markers that I also show from an earlier project that are referred to as dried blood spots, developed by Carol Worthman, Tom McDade, and some other bioculture anthropologists. These involve kind of needle pricks to the finger and then milking the finger to draw out these blood spots that are then analyzed. Both of these are very field friendly, and that's very important to anthropologists like myself. And some of them, like the Tasso device, can actually be self-administered, I'd say more or less effectively. Biocultural projects like these can involve some logistical challenges, such as how to keep those samples chilled in remote Indian village locations during scorching summer heat. So I would advise that you inform yourself about the storage and transport of any samples featuring in a biocultural project, like cortisol molecules, for example. Each molecule is different. So there you see in some villages in central India that I'll talk about in a moment, we had a portable diesel generator that would sometimes go on the fritz. And then we also have this small refrigerator that we would plug in use the power via the generator to store our samples. I'd add that ethnographers conceptualize their craft differently. For an empirical investigation of how U.S. anthropologists understand their research methods, see my team's recent article where we identified actually what I call 5 different flavors of ethnographers, with that article appearing soon in the Annals of Anthropological Practice. I just raised this idea here is because I do want you to know that even the notion of ethnography is contested, and people might practice it differently. So I have my way of doing things, but I understand that there are other ways of doing things as well. On this slide, I won't linger on it too long, but let me just explain a few things. If you look at the x-axis, we polled U.S. cultural anthropologists about their practices, and we had 169 items. We used factor analysis, and we developed some kind of scales that you can see running along the x-axis. Those are 11 different scales plus a mean of all their scales. We had reasons for doing that. And then on the y-axis, it's basically rating in terms of like importance on a kind of 1 to 5 ordinal scale. And then if you see the different kind of dotted lines, there are actually 5 different lines, and you can look at each of those groups and say, okay, how much are they saying that a given kind of scale is important? On the top, there's what I call the qual-quant kind of toolkit approach. They practice a lot of different kinds of ethnographic methods, including quantitative methods. At the bottom, there's what we call methodological minimalist. And then there's a critical participatory textualist, not a little bit of an awkward phrasing, but we're trying to do justice to the scales. Anyway, if you want more details on that, you could email me, or you could also look for that forthcoming in the Annals of Anthropological Practice. You might think about which flavor are you if we have ethnographers and things. Now back to the topic at hand. That Field Methods article, figure 1, again, I'm referencing that earlier slide, this is what the talk is based on. It's a published article on field methods. It gives an overview of the procedures my co-authors and I described for assessing cultural concepts of distress. We recommend an initial period of unstructured or semi-structured ethnographic work, exploring, you can see that at the top, exploring how people in the community think about, talk about, and respond to distress on multiple registers. That could be emotional, physical, behavioral, social. And this information can be elicited with participant observation in everyday life and specific settings like clinics or other sites of healing. But other approaches include in-depth narrative, life history, and/or phenomenological interviews or focus group discussions centered around themes of distress and expanding on participant observation findings to explore topics in greater detail. When working with children and adolescents, these techniques can include body mapping or pictorial approaches to capture the experience of distress. These approaches can also be supplemented with structured methods, or I'd say more structured methods like free list and pile sorts, wherein researchers simply ask individuals to list common experiences or signs of distress and subsequently sort them into groups. These psychological and anthropological methods are sometimes referred to as cultural domain analysis in the center of the slide, in the sense that a researcher aims to identify how members of a group or community think and talk about a given topic or domain of understanding. Cultural domain analysis will be my focus today, given how these techniques are quite useful, underappreciated, I would say, and easily integrated into ethnographic or other kinds of research. So I don't have much else to see on the slide. I know it's somewhat complicated. Maybe it seems a little bit overwhelming, but remember, these are all choices that you make. You don't do all this. But I would say at the top of the slide, there's a kind of more open-ended kind of phase, and then cultural domain, which is not necessary. I think it's quite useful in the center to refine some of the scale measures, say, that you're developing, and then some scale validation measures at the bottom. You can consult my recent book if you want to learn more about structured ethnographic methods like cultural domain analysis, including free list, pile sort, and what's referred to as cultural consensus analysis, but also about the role that personal network analysis and text analysis can play in ethnographic research. In that book, and I think this is a real strength of the book, my co-authors and I describe in detail, accompanied by practical exercises and software guides and little small data sets and things like that, how to do all of what I described today. I'm going to run through some things related to cultural domain analysis. If you don't get it all, there's a lot of other resources that you can consult, including this book of mine. I'd add that the Field Methods article's appendices provide the rationale and extensive references on some of the other methods, which I won't have time to discuss today. There's also an additional appendix with a really, I think, well-done case study on Haiti, talking about how, in a different way, talking about many things I'm touching on today, by largely focusing on the work of Bonnie Kaiser and Brandon Court, two of my co-authors in this paper. Before I turn to my ethnographic illustrations of how researchers might construct scales to more precisely assess psychosocial experiences, let me say a few things first about cultural domain analysis. As I said, the suite of techniques, including free lists and pile sorts, can be used to assess how members of a group think about a given topic that is the focus of speech. In the first steps, respondents list items they find salient or meaningful in relation to a given topic and probed by the researcher. As shown on this slide, this is a powerful way to capture a local cultural insider, or EMIC, point of view on things, and thus can play important roles in ethnographic research on cultural concepts of distress. Yeah, there's just a few kind of key bullet points on free listing. Relatively free from bias in the sense that you're asking people to list the terms that they find meaningful in a given domain rather than imposing those on respondents. Free listing stages of study are often followed by pile sorts, where researchers ask respondents to sort into meaningful categories sets of terms they find related in some way, often explaining the basis for how they divide up the items into piles. This provides insight not only into the content, but also what I would call the structure of a cultural domain. So there you can read a little bit about pile sorts. If the fish are confusing you, we're talking about cultural concepts of distress today, but a lot of the early work was on ecological or biological kinds of concepts of often fish or animals or plants or things in the natural world. I think I'll keep going. A typical method is what's called an unconstrained pile sort, where a researcher generally lets study participants divide up the items as they like, with just a few simple rules, like you can't just make a single pile. And you can read a few more things on the slide as well. Thinking out loud through the process to give insight into how people are conceptualizing a domain of experience. Again, for me, it's going to be, when I get to my examples, like emotion or mental health type things, or being type experiences related to well-being. There's software which helps with this analysis, including a program referred to as Visual Anthropac. And I would add, and I'm going to talk about the kind of notation here in the .txt file in just a moment, but you collect the data, which is pretty straightforward, and I'll say a few things about that in a moment. But there's a lot of different kinds of ways you can analyze the data: multidimensional scaling, cultural consensus analysis, also just like looking, qualitatively, it's a small sample at how people are sorting things. Here's a behind the scenes look at what the software is doing, which relies on matrix manipulation. You don't need to understand this, but I think it's always good to try to go deeper into the method. So what's going on here? So this is pile sort data. On the left, there's like items like A through K, for example, and individuals would be placing different items in different piles, item A and item B. And then the idea is, how often is item A and item B, or item A and item K, et cetera, found in the same pile? So if you look at the middle of the slide, each individual, you're looking at a kind of a true false type statement on the item by item matrix. How often did those items occur for that particular individual? And then finally, you're aggregating all that data across all the respondents on my right, to get a kind of similarity between the items. So in a moment, I'm going to talk about emotion terms, but it's like happiness and sadness. Are those quite different? Or those be oddly, surprisingly similar? Or joy and happiness? Maybe that's a better example. So this suite of techniques can show you that kind of structure, that similarity across the items. Within this program, the data is entered in a .txt file in a particular format, which you can easily learn. Now, it does look, sometimes my students get intimidated by this, but if you've never worked with this kind of data, all these are is like instructions to the software telling it what to do. And it's very straightforward to learn. So it's just things like data language. What's that? It's just a message to the software. You just have to put that in the .txt file. But there's other things like the number of informants, the number of items overall that are being sorted. And then each of those blocks, you go down in the .txt file, those are anonymized kinds of informant found, and then the kind of informant identifier. And then each of those lines is the items in the pile that were sorted. So the way we do it is often a number on one side. If you use like an index card, this is the older way to do it, though there's online software that can help as well. On the other side is like the name of the item. So they sort them and you give them instructions, you have them talk about things, and then you jot down the way individuals are sorting the piles. You'll see sometimes there are splitters and sometimes there are lumpers. Some people make a lot of piles and some people make they want to make one big pile or maybe two piles or something. It's quite informative for the kind of culturally informed thinking on a given topic. Now let me illustrate these principles with some examples. In my work in central India with indigenous Sahara conservation refugees, I've used these cultural domain analysis techniques to construct a positive and negative affect scale, or PANAS, which is sensitive to Sahara tribal culture. You can see the terms on the right of the slide. The main technique employed here was free listing. I asked respondents, when everything in your household, family, life is going well or poorly, what kinds of mental and physical feelings do you have? I then took the most culturally salient items, 20 positive and 20 negative items, and created this 40-item being measure, which I would call a culturally informed insider measure, because it's based on free listing combined with some my own observations and interviews of my team, for example. Again, it's ethnographic in the manner it captures local experiences and aids in my understanding of local sociocultural processes. This scale turned out to be a good predictor of psychosocial outcomes, better than standard anxiety and depression scales, which we also used in the field, for example, responding in more sensitive ways to processes related to relocation and deforestation, as shown in the lower left in this slide. You might not be able to make total sense of that, but on the x-axis down there, those are 4 villages. And then on the kind of y-axis, it's how high did they score on the positive compared to negative kinds of emotions. Higher score would be a higher balance of positive compared to negative emotions. On the far, these are pseudonyms, but Hudinugger was a village, for example, with really good forest cover, more isolated. And then Guvari, just to the left of that, was a non-displaced village. I'll say more about that in a moment. And then next to that, all the way to the left, is a displaced village, also with poor forest cover. So the idea is this measure responding in kind of predictable ways that we would we'd expect, like where there's higher levels of stress, for example, you would see a lower level of positive compared to negative emotion experiences reported. And those are the kinds of things that we saw. Incidentally, that cultural and contextual sensitivity is part of what I'd call ethnographic or EMIC, E-M-I-C validity. Let me present a few slides from my fieldwork with the Sahara to give you a sense of the social and environmental context of this research of mine. So these maps locate the Sahara in India in the Kuno Wildlife Sanctuary. You can see a displaced village and a village in buffer zone and all different things there. Here's a shot of 2 Sahara who had been displaced from their homeland in the name of wildlife conservation. I wanted to understand the resulting stress they experienced and how they mitigated such stress. This shows a fence that separated them from their ancestral forest, a stress-inducing situation. Here's some Sahara children. Water scarcity is a problem in this arid region, with water acquisition falling on women's shoulders in particularly burdensome ways. So again, those kinds of contextual factors. Is the emotion scale sensitive to potential gender differences in stress and distress? For example, those are ways that you might validate, in a sense, these scales. Very different than a kind of psychologist approach, for example. But that's the way I think about things. Here's a shot of a forest village inside the wildlife sanctuary's buffer zone, just outside the cordoned off core of the sanctuary. I examined relationships between Sahara individuals' self-reports of emotional experience in the PANOS scale on the one hand, and other factors including stress biomarkers like salivary cortisol levels and buccal cell telomere length on the other hand, in order to enhance my ethnographic understanding of distress and wellness in these village contexts. For example, we engaged some local doctors to come in and take some health measures that we then looked for different kinds of patterns of association with some of our other cultural and social and other kinds of network measures. Okay, I'm going to move on to my next example. In my next illustration, I turned to my gaming health research where my team and I relied largely on formal coding of interviews, including free list questions, subsequently refined with field questionnaires and cultural consensus analysis to develop a gamer insider scale measure of positive and negative play experiences. These ethnographic scales, 21 positive experience items and 21 corresponding negative items, to form a 42-item positive and negative gaming experiences measure, or PNGE 42. That's our own way of capturing that. These proved more meaningful and, this is important, met less gamer resistance than standard psychiatric scale assessments of so-called internet gaming disorder. You can imagine that many gamers or players of video games or other kinds of games might not want to think about themselves as being addicted. So is that language alien to them, or are there ways to get a language that better connects to their experiences in the way they think about and play their games? As such, I found it more informative, this PNGE 42, in my ethnographic analyses of cultural processes related to gamer health and well-being. There's a kind of parallelism between the positive and negative scale. If you look at that paper, you'll see what I mean there. And I carried a similar mix of ethnographic methods to my study of face-to-face gaming centers in Udaipur, Rajasthan, India. These centers are referred to locally as gaming zones or gaming lounges. So again, the way people play or do anything is quite important, as you might imagine. So the context to any anthropological study of health and well-being. Online gaming contexts like this context that many of these young Indians played, or these young adult Indians, CSGO or Counter-Strike Global Offensive, a first-person shooter game. These online gaming contexts connected Udaipuri players in Rajasthan, India, with others around the world. These were also important in my ethnographic investigation of relationships between gaming and health. Of interest, the ethnographically developed 21-item gaming distress scale. So this is just the distress, the negative, so-called negative scale rather than positive scale. This contains a wider symptoms pool than typical short symptoms pool is an interesting term. We could talk about that. A wider symptoms pool than typical short gaming disorder scales. This also allowed my team and I to disentangle what I would refer to as core, even showing a lot of affinity to addictive kinds of experiences, from other more culturally influenced problem gaming experiences and behaviors in different culture regions like North America, Europe, and China. We did identify a consistent 4-factor structure in each region, each of those 3 regions, with the first factor in particular in each case characterized by classic addiction symptoms. I find that quite interesting. And 2 of the other 3 factors, loss of pleasure and regret, also closely related to addiction experiences and behaviors. So the 4th factor, toxicity, is outside the purview of typical so-called addiction measures. We interpret our results largely to support current WHO formulations of gaming-related distress as an addictive disorder, though we show how local cultural forces can shape the manner that both so-called addictive and scare quotes problem gaming are experienced and thus psychiatrically presented in different parts of the world. Finally, in my third illustration, let me note how the emically valid Sahara PANAS, or positive and negative affect scale, that emotion scale, has been critical to helping me understand how ritual practices and religious commitment might provide sources of well-being and resilience, especially in situations of social and environmental precarity. There's an article in Current Anthropology if you're interested in this topic. Here's a Sahara shrine outside the forest village I showed you earlier. Combining ethnography with structured survey and salivary analyte data, including that PANAS emotion scale and the stress hormone cortisol, we tracked distress over 2 9-day periods before, during, and after Sahara celebrations of the Hindu holidays of Holi and Navratri. That study included respondents who, as spirit mediums, channeled divinities such as the Mother Goddess becoming her divine avatars or embodiments. Results showed post-ritual improvement on all psychiatric and analyte biomarker data. For example, there were improvements of 27%, 29%, and 19% over 9 days on the study's 3 health outcomes. Diurnal cortisol, it was a diurnal slope. We could talk about that if you want. Self-reported stress, a kind of outsider scale, and that culturally insider emic scale, the PANAS. In my gaming research, I've developed similar ethnographic methods, again, including the P and GE42 scales for positive and negative gaming experiences, to investigate how player bonds with their characters or digital avatars can be therapeutic. One participant in that inquiry, Sandy, reports as life-affirming, playing her stronger, faster, more skillful, and live alter ego, Sandaria. I developed these avatar therapy or drama therapy, you might call them, and cultural concepts of wellness themes extensively in my new book, The Avatar Faculty, if you are interested. Okay, let me wrap things up. To conclude, attending to cultural insider perspectives is necessary because expressions of distress, I'm going to repeat what I said earlier, thresholds of tolerance for distress, expectations about stress inherent in life, conceptions of the good life, symptom expression, and modes of help seeking vary across cultures. As such, we need tools that are sensitive to cultural processes and social and environmental conditions. One promising direction, I believe, is to think of what we might call cultural insider or EMIC, EMIC validity, as an umbrella term that captures other standard forms of psychometric validation, though in reference to internal cultural processes rather than external or so-called etic standards. For example, emic validity could be thought of as a particularly reflexive form of face validity. Okay, I got a note that my sound was changing. I'm not sure what that is. It might be thought of as a kind of reflexive form of face validity with more culturally sensitive measures more likely to be accepted by respondents. Similarly, the free listing, interview, observational, etc. methods discussed in this talk if done properly, should help researchers identify key terms to be placed in the measure, leading to what psychologists might refer to as content validity. Cultural domain and consensus analysis, I talked a good deal about cultural domain analysis today, can also point to a shared social sense that the measure's terms fit together, file sorting, right? And or a meaningful construct of the domain in question. You might call that construct validity. Thought of in this way, ethnographic measures, such as I've described, need not replace, but rather only complement and extend current biomedical and psychological tools, particularly where the languages used to express suffering differ from so-called weird societies or those Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies. Thank you. Let me also thank a few more people here. I'll go to my acknowledgements. So I do want to acknowledge my co-authors on this field methods piece. This is not just my work. I think of this in dialogue with the work of a lot of other people, not just these people, who are doing really very interesting, deep work on this topic. I'd also like to thank the editors of Field Methods. And then there you can see some of our funding. And then if you had access, I can make these slides available to you. That's just those are all the studies that I referenced today. If anyone was interested, you could contact me, or maybe I could make those available through Spark. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Such a rich array of things to process and think through. Does anyone have a question or a comment or an area that you want to explore? I'll wait for a moment, and then if not, I have many coming up. I've been really excited about what you're doing because I do a lot of community engaged research with very different kinds of communities. And I think many community engaged researchers, I really hate the psychometric scales that we often get stuck with. And so the idea of being able to add to and still use some of the scales that are, at least within, I think, US and Canadian social services, still very embedded and still very much what governments and funders and people believe in, but then being able to do this mixing of methods and this kind of triaging to be able to better inform what might be slightly problematic in those scales without trying to introduce something brand new. It feels like a useful way of a transitional step, maybe. So I was curious about that, about the understandable critique of where we've been, but the embeddedness of those kinds of measures within existing systems.
Yes, no, for sure. Thanks, Alison. You raised a lot of important issues. Yeah, I think a lot of those issues are inherent to things that people like me are trying to accomplish in our work. Yeah, I think if you work in different communities around the world, or even in the US or Canada, you'll often find there's a kind of resistance to certain ways of talking and capturing experience related to health and well-being. But yeah, the guiding principle is there must be a way, or wouldn't there be utility in getting closer to the way that people themselves experience and talk about their person, their body, or their health, or their mind, or whatever. So that's really the guiding framework, for getting into this this cultural insider point of view. Incidentally, you don't have to make choices. There's a kind of give and take between if you get a measure that's just so beautifully captures something local, there is a cost to that. It's like, what's the kind of, psychologists might call it external validity. Can I use this somewhere else? How do I compare like levels of stress that are going on here compared to somewhere else? So I think there are reasons to integrate like that stress measure, which was a kind of outsider ethics kind of standard stress measure. I see problems in it, but it actually proved relatively useful and does provide for higher levels of comparability. So you can mix methods and measures. I'm a strong proponent of what some call like triangulation, 3 different methods, and then see what happens. And you can do more than 3. So it's not always a triangle, but we could do other kinds of shapes. But see what happens. You don't necessarily expect them to all say the same thing. or show the same things. The methods have strengths and limits, and they direct people to different kinds of ways of reporting their experience. Yeah, so that's the key thing. Another thing you mentioned earlier, Allison, which I ended up cutting it for time, but two things. One, early on, we do a nice little history. It's pretty short of kind of colonial psychiatry and the kind of aim to equate. There's like these standard, almost like psychiatric kinds of categories. It could be depression, anxiety, or epilepsy, or, whatever it is. Let's go see, do we find something similar in other places around the world? So that's different than what I'm describing here. You can see potentially some problems there. And then at the end of the paper, we talk about the utility of community-based and participatory methods, which I see and some of my co-authors see as a real future in this area, even more getting members of community involved in the process of research and building these skills in ways that make sense to them and connect to the kinds of things that they think are important or applications of the work or whatever.
Yeah, thank you for that. In my sideline work in evaluation, I love Q methodology, and your pile sorts reminded me a lot of the kinds of insights that come when you simply ask people to find the order within a whole lot of different ideas.
And I know that's why I did again, these are so-called optional methods. You don't have to do free lists. Incidentally, a free list question, it can just be in an interview, right? List the things associated with X or Y. So it's not like a big deal. And you can do follow-up prompts and all that kind of stuff. But no, I think just like having people list emotions that are like important to them or whatever it is, right? And then you look at what are the first terms that they mentioned? How many terms did they mention? How was this term mentioned across how many respondents, for example? So there are these kinds of saliency indices that are incredibly powerful and informative for experience in a given setting, right? Then the pile sort extends that, and you start to see not just maybe the content with the saliency of the individual items, almost like in a list format, but how those items might be related to each other. Yes, I think those kinds of things are very powerful, and they complement some of the other ethnographic methods that I mentioned in this talk.
You're right that they're quite simple.
They're very simple, and that's why I hesitate sometimes to show the file format. But one of the things we tried to do in our book was like to show that it's just a language of communicating with a computer or a piece of software that is actually making your job easier. You just have to do things in standard ways. And if you do that, you get these kinds of very informative kinds of analyses.
Hey, anyone else?
Audience is quiet today.
Yeah, seriously.
I gave you a lot to think about. I hope maybe a few questions here. And if not, you can maybe follow up on some of the things I talked about.
Absolutely. Feel free if something occurs to you later to just reach out and we will. Sorry, directly. Okay, not hearing anything. I think we will say goodbye. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you, Frozen, everyone. Okay, bye, everyone.
Bye.